The railroads came first. That part everyone agrees on. By the mid-1800s, rail networks were expanding across Europe and North America at a pace that historians describe as one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. Cities were connecting. Economies were shifting. And at the center of it all, train stations were being built, grand, cathedral-like structures of stone and iron, rising in city after city, decade after decade. That explanation holds, until you look at the numbers. Because here is what the records show. Some of the largest, most architecturally complex train stations ever built were completed in cities whose entire populations at the time of construction could not have filled them, not even close. Not on their busiest day. Not during their largest festival. Not under any reasonable projection available to the engineers and city planners who commissioned them. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions, but the questions are there, and they are precise. Let's begin with what the official record tells us. The railway boom, as it is taught, was a response to industrialization. Factories needed workers. Workers needed transit. Cities were growing, rapidly, visibly, urgently. And so, civic leaders and private rail companies invested in infrastructure to meet that demand. This is the standard explanation. It is logical. It is well documented. And for the most part, it describes something real. Except, the scale doesn't follow the demand. When you examine the construction dates of major train terminals in mid to late 19th century cities, something becomes difficult to ignore. These weren't modest transit hubs sized to serve existing populations with room to grow. These were structures built at scales that would have required populations 3, 4, sometimes 5 times larger than the cities they served. Populations that, in many cases, wouldn't arrive for another 50 to 80 years. That gap is not a rounding error. That gap is a planning decision. And it raises a question that the standard explanation doesn't fully answer. Who told them to build this big? Consider what large-scale public architecture normally requires. Before a government or private entity commits to a construction project of monumental scale, certain conditions are typically met. There is a demonstrated need. There are population projections. There are economic forecasts. There are rival proposals, cost debates, committee reviews. The decision to build a train station the size of a cathedral, with marble floors, vaulted iron ceilings, waiting halls that can hold thousands simultaneously, is not a casual one. It implies confidence. A specific, unwavering confidence that the space will be needed. In the 1840s and 1850s, cities like Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and St. Louis had populations ranging from 20,000 to roughly 80,000 people. These were significant cities for their time. But their train stations, multiple of which were constructed or planned in this era, were built with passenger throughput capacities that would only become realistic in the early 20th century. 80 years. That is not planning ahead. That is knowing something. The standard response to this observation is one of two arguments. The first, rail companies were speculative investors. They built big because they expected growth and their optimism was eventually vindicated. The second, architectural fashion of the era simply favored grandeur, and size was as much about civic prestige as practical function. Both arguments are reasonable. Neither is complete. Because if speculative investment explains the scale, it should also explain inconsistency. Speculative projects fail. They overreach in some places and underreach in others. They are uneven because speculation is uneven. But the pattern seen across these stations is remarkably consistent. Not just within a single country but across multiple continents, multiple languages, multiple independent civic traditions. And if architectural fashion explains the grandeur, it should explain the functional overpreparation as well. Decorative columns are fashion. 200 ticketing windows in a city of 30,000 people is something else. The aesthetic and the functional are both oversized. At the same time. In the same places. Repeatedly. There is another detail that researchers studying this period have found difficult to place neatly into the standard narrative: the construction timelines. Several of these stations, which required sophisticated engineering, large-span iron roof systems, underground drainage, multi-platform track configurations, were completed in time frames that, even by modern standards, would be considered aggressive. Some were built in under 5 years. A few in under 3. This was an era before power tools, before motorized cranes, before computer-aided structural design. Labor was abundant, yes. Materials were increasingly available. But the organizational complexity required to coordinate the construction of a building the size of a city block, with the precision these structures demanded, was not trivial. And yet they were built, finished, operational, often ahead of schedule. When historians note this, the usual framing is admiration. These were remarkable feats of Victorian engineering, which they were. But remarkable in a way that carries an unasked question underneath it. Remarkable compared to what? Compared to what we expected these builders to be capable of? Or compared to something they appeared to have already known how to do? Some of the finishing details compound this unease further. The acoustic properties of several 19th century station halls are, by modern analysis, extraordinarily well engineered. Sound behavior in large public spaces is notoriously difficult to predict and control. Even today, major concert halls require years of iterative design. Yet certain historic train terminals demonstrate acoustic profiles that minimize echo, distribute ambient noise evenly, and reduce crowd-produced chaos in ways that serve large volumes of people effectively. This is not decoration. This is not fashion. Acoustic engineering of this caliber serves a crowd. A large crowd. A crowd the city at the time of construction did not have. Functionality designed for a future the builders could not have formally projected. That phrase sits in the historical record without a clean home. None of this, taken individually, is an anomaly that cannot be explained. Growth projections can be aggressive. Civic ambition can be aspirational. Engineering talent can be underestimated by later generations. But the accumulation of these patterns, scale, speed, functional specificity, acoustic precision, demographic mismatch, begins to feel less like a series of independent decisions and more like evidence of a consistent logic operating beneath the visible record. What that logic was, where it came from, and whether it connects to anything broader, those questions don't yet have the answer the evidence seems to be pulling toward. But the patterns are just beginning. By the 1850s and 1860s, the United States was in the middle of its great westward expansion. Cities were forming rapidly, some almost overnight, as rail lines pushed into territories that had only years before been largely unsettled by European-descended populations. The conventional narrative describes this as infrastructure chasing growth. Rails arrived, towns followed. Stations were built to serve the towns that existed, with room for the towns that were coming. Except in city after city, what was built did not match what was there. And the mismatch was not modest. Indianapolis is a useful case to examine carefully. In 1853, the city had a population of approximately 8,000 people. It was a young city, incorporated only in 1821, with a downtown still taking shape, unpaved roads in many areas, and an economy that was functional but not dominant by regional standards. And yet the Union Station that would be constructed there, with planning beginning in this very period, was designed at a scale that would not find its natural population until well into the 20th century. The eventual 1888 structure, which replaced an earlier terminal on the same ambitious footprint, featured a grand waiting room, multiple platforms, and a passenger handling capacity that, when placed against the city's population at time of first planning, represents a ratio that is difficult to call ordinary foresight. Standard explanation: the city was projected to grow. Rail investment would accelerate that growth. Build for the future. But this logic, applied consistently, should also produce occasional failures. Stations that turned out too large, that sat underused for generations, that became civic embarrassments requiring downsizing or repurposing. That outcome exists in some places. But the overwhelming pattern across major American rail terminals is not dramatic failure of projection. It is eventual vindication, often after 50 or more years. The buildings were eventually needed. Which raises the question again: how long is a projection, and at what point does projection become something closer to knowledge? Move north and east and the pattern does not dissolve, it intensifies. Grand Central Terminal in New York, in its current Beaux-Arts form completed in 1913, is often held up as a triumph of ambitious civic planning. But look at what preceded it on the same site, and at the broader decisions made in its design. The terminal was built with 44 platforms and 67 tracks. At the time of its completion, usage was significant. New York was already a major city, but the infrastructure was designed with a redundancy and a depth of capacity that planners explicitly acknowledged would take decades to be fully utilized. That acknowledgement is, in itself, interesting. The planners knew the capacity was ahead of the demand. They built it anyway. And they built it not just at the platform level, but underground with 2 full levels of track infrastructure, requiring excavation and engineering of extraordinary complexity for the era. The decision to build downward, invisibly, for a future population rather than outward for a current one, is a specific kind of confidence. It is the confidence of someone who is not guessing. Across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom presents a parallel that some researchers find even more striking, because the British context removes certain American variables, like frontier optimism or speculative land investment, that are sometimes used to explain scale decisions in U.S. cities. St. Pancras Station in London, opened in 1868, was at the time of its completion the largest enclosed space in the world. The single-span iron roof, 73 meters wide, was an engineering achievement that required design methods being developed, in some cases as the structure was being built. It was not built to house a current volume of passengers. It was built, as the historical record shows, in direct competition with nearby terminals, partly for prestige and partly for a passenger volume that its operators expected, but could not guarantee, would come. The roof, the scale, the Gothic hotel facade that accompanied it, all of this was built for a city that already existed, yes, but for a usage level that London would only reach reliably in the early 20th century. And Street Pancras is not an outlier. Liverpool Lime Street, Bristol Temple Meads, Manchester Piccadilly's early configurations. Each of these structures, examined against the population and passenger data of their construction period, exhibits the same quality, functional capacity that arrives early, that sits partially unfilled, and that only decades later finds the crowd it appeared to have been designed for. There is a specific architectural element worth examining across both American and British terminals of this era: the waiting hall. The waiting hall is the most human-scaled space in a train station. It is where passengers sit, stand, move through, and gather. Unlike platforms, which can be expanded, or track infrastructure, which can be added underground, the waiting hall is built once, in its primary dimensions, and those dimensions reflect a direct assumption about how many human bodies the designers expected to manage simultaneously. In station after station, built in cities of tens of thousands, the waiting halls were sized for hundreds of thousands. Not occasionally. Not in capital cities with clear arguments for scale. In mid-sized regional cities. In cities that were growing, yes, but growing along trajectories that any reasonable projection of the era would have capped well below what the waiting hall dimensions implied. This is the part of the pattern that resists the prestige argument most directly. A Gothic facade is prestige. A 400-foot waiting hall is logistics. What makes the consistency of this pattern uncomfortable is precisely what makes it analytically interesting. It is not a feature of one nation's building culture or one era's architectural fashion or one company's speculative appetite. It appears with remarkable regularity across independent civic traditions, across different languages and legal systems and construction industries, across a period spanning several decades and multiple generations of planners and engineers. When a pattern appears once, it is an anomaly. When it appears in a dozen cities across 2 continents, built by independent hands within a similar window of time, it begins to suggest something that the word coincidence does not comfortably contain. Some researchers studying 19th century infrastructure development have begun grouping these observations: the scale mismatches, the early functionality, the speed of construction, the acoustic and logistical precision, under a broader interpretive framework. A label more than a theory. A category for patterns that the standard narrative acknowledges without fully absorbing. That label and what it does and does not claim to explain is where this examination is heading. But before arriving there, one more pattern deserves attention, because it may be the most precise of all. The label is Tartaria. And it is important to be precise about what that word means, and what it does not mean, before examining how it intersects with the patterns this documentary has been tracing. In mainstream historical records, Tartaria, sometimes spelled Tataria, refers to a loosely defined geographic and political designation used primarily by European cartographers and diplomats between roughly the 13th and 18th centuries. On maps from this period, Tartaria, or Great Tartary, appears as a vast territorial label covering much of Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of what is now Russia and China. It was not, in this conventional usage, a unified empire with a single government or capital. It was a cartographic shorthand, a way of labeling the sprawling, difficult to categorize territories occupied by various Turkic and Mongolic peoples east of the Caspian Sea. Historians are largely consistent on this point. Tartaria, as a political entity, was a European perception as much as a geographic reality. Its borders shifted depending on who was drawing the map. Its governance was fragmented. It appears in the historical record as a label of convenience, not a civilization with a coherent identity. That is the conventional interpretation. And it is, by the standards of available evidence, defensible. But a separate, more recent interpretation has developed. One that uses the same word to describe something quite different. In this reading, Tartaria functions not as a cartographic convenience but as a placeholder for a broader, unresolved question: whether the 19th century world inherited infrastructure, architectural knowledge, or organizational systems from a prior period whose full scope is not reflected in the standard historical timeline. This interpretation does not claim, in its more careful formulations, that a secret empire was erased from history. It does not allege malicious revision or deliberate concealment. What it does suggest, and this is where its resonance with the train station patterns becomes visible, is that certain features of 19th century construction are difficult to explain purely through the lens of a civilization building entirely from scratch, from the resources and knowledge it demonstrably had, for the population it demonstrably served. Some researchers who use this framework point to the train stations specifically, not as proof of anything, but as a category of evidence that fits uncomfortably inside the standard explanation. There are multiple ways to interpret that discomfort, and intellectual honesty requires presenting them with equal weight. The first interpretation is the one mainstream historians would endorse. The scale mismatches, the speed, the functional overpreparation. These are all explained by a combination of civic ambition, speculative investment, engineering talent that history has systematically underestimated, and the simple fact that growth projections, when made by people with genuine expertise and access to trend data, are often more accurate than later generations give them credit for. The Victorian era, on this reading, was simply a period of extraordinary human capability and forward vision. The stations were built big because the people who built them understood, better than we now assume, where their cities were going. This interpretation is coherent. It is supported by a substantial body of historical scholarship. It does not require any revision of the standard timeline. The second interpretation sits closer to the Tartaria framework, without fully adopting its more speculative claims. This reading suggests that some of what the 19th century constructed, or reconstructed, drew on knowledge, templates, or physical infrastructure that predated the commonly accepted origin points of that construction. Not necessarily from a single empire or civilization, but from a body of accumulated technical understanding that the standard historical record attributes to the 19th century but which may have roots that run deeper and earlier. The train stations on this reading are not anomalies of ambitious planning, they are traces of a prior logic being applied to a new context. This interpretation is more difficult to evaluate. It rests on inference rather than documentation. But it is not, in its careful forms, an irrational inference. The patterns that support it are real, even if the explanation it proposes is contested. A third interpretation, perhaps the most intellectually uncomfortable of the three, does not choose between the first two. It simply observes that the standard explanation and the alternative interpretation both contain elements that the available evidence supports, and elements that the available evidence cannot fully resolve. On this reading, the train stations are genuinely ambiguous artifacts. They can be read as evidence of Victorian ambition. They can be read as evidence of something older operating beneath the visible record. The data does not currently force a choice between these readings. What the Tartaria label provides for researchers working in this space is not an answer. That point is worth stating clearly. The label functions as a container, a way of grouping observations that don't fit neatly into the standard narrative, holding them together long enough to examine whether their collective weight suggests a pattern or merely a coincidence. Used carefully, that is a legitimate intellectual function. Anomalies require categories before they can be analyzed. The question is whether the category itself begins to shape the analysis, whether the label starts to produce conclusions rather than contain questions. That risk is real. And it is one that the more serious researchers working adjacent to this framework openly acknowledge. The train stations remain standing. That is the simplest and most undeniable fact in this entire examination. They were built. They were used. They eventually, in most cases, found the crowds they appeared to have been designed for. Whatever logic produced them, the logic worked. But the question of whose logic it was, and whether that logic was operating from a baseline of knowledge that the 19th century formally possessed, or from something it had access to but did not originate, is a question that the buildings themselves cannot answer. Stone does not record intent. Iron does not preserve the conversation in which a chief engineer told a city council to build a waiting hall for 400,000 people in a city of 30,000. The specifications survive. The reasoning in many cases does not. And that gap, between what was built and what can be explained, is where the Tartaria interpretation finds its most durable foothold. Not in accusations, not in claims of erasure, but in the simple, persistent fact that certain 19th century structures appear to have been built by people who knew something that the records do not fully show us they knew. Whether that knowledge came from exceptional human foresight, from inherited technical traditions, or from something that the standard timeline has not yet found a place for, the stations do not say. They simply stand. Larger than they needed to be. Older than the crowds they were built for. Waiting, as they always seem to be, for something just slightly ahead of what the record shows.